Hi everybody, this is Dorothy Pichello with the Chicago Club. We are so happy to have you with us today. We miss you so much, but we know how much you really love to travel. Many of you have taken our trips, our day trips all over Southern California, and it's the highlight of our month. It's the highlight of what we are. But we can't be with you on a trip, but we thought we'd try something different. We're going to take a day trip, we're going to take a walking trip, and we're going to be able to show you some of the great silhouettes and some of the different cities that we visit without getting on a bus. So hold on, get off the sofa, because we're going to be taking a trip to many of the favorite destinations that you've heard about in Bill's lectures that I hope you've enjoyed, but we're going to go beyond it, and it'll be live. It will be live in all of our favorite cities in Southern California. This morning we're delighted to have Bill with us. And if you know Bill, you love Bill. But if you don't know Bill, you're going to love him by the end of this session. So Bill, I'd like to introduce you.
Thank you.
Bill Hoffman from Hoffman Tours.
Yeah. Thank you, Dorothy. And I do love the Chicago Club. I've been a tour guide for 7 years. My name is Bill Hoffman. They know me as Hoffy, and I love showing people beautiful cities and beautiful places. We've done over 45 tours with the Chicago Club, and we're going to get back on the bus real soon. So I started my tour business when I got my PhD from UC Irvine. I started to notice how many beautiful places there were in Southern California. And we're lucky here in Orange County. San Juan Capistrano is the birthplace of Orange County. So right now we're at the Mission San Juan Capistrano, which is the 7th of the 21 missions. So as I talk, I'm going to ask Carmen to stand up, and we're going to show you a little bit of the mission as I talk about it. So in this area in 1776, Franciscan missionaries began to convert Native American Ahashiman to the Catholic faith. And they built this incredible mission over the years. It's one of the most famous missions for several reasons. Number one, sadly, there was a terrible earthquake in 1812, and it destroyed the old stone church. When we go inside the mission on a future tour, we're going to look at that. Also, when Mexico mission fell into disrepair, but some heroes saved the mission, and they gradually started to rebuild it. When they rebuilt it, they discovered that these wonderful swallows were coming in, and suddenly San Juan Capistrano became a very important tourist destination. Now it's one of the most beautiful and visited missions, and it's a non-profit educational foundation. Here's Dorothy again.
Here we are at the entrance of the mission in San Juan Capistrano. And one thing I want to remind you of, do you realize we're only 20 minutes from Laguna Woods? So that's going to be the beauty of our visit today, because it wasn't a long ride, and it's a ride you can do by yourself, and you can do it safely with your loved ones. So this is the entrance of the San Juan Capistrano Inn and the mission, and I'm going to have Bill talk to more about us about the mission.
Thank you. Thank you, Dorothy. I think it's kind of funny. Look at the sign, and when you come back to the sign, Carmen, it says worth a visit. Are you kidding me? It's one of the best missions. It's totally worth a visit. And 1776, I think you'd agree, is a pretty famous date. So one thing on my tours, they're very educational, and I have us take a second look at places that you may or may not have noticed. So why is San Juan Capistrano so special? Well, the reason is, not only is it historic, but the city did a great job in controlling the architecture and the design. So as we pan down famous Camino Capistrano, you can see the trading post, which is Western false front architecture. You can see all the buildings are low scale. The general plan of San Juan Capistrano does not allow metal buildings, it does not allow glass buildings, it does not allow plastic signs. So what's the result? You get a beautiful historic streetscape without any. To be honest, folks, Orange County grew very fast, and it's mostly built for the car. But downtown San Juan Capistrano is built for history, and it's built for becoming increasingly popular. And by the way, they built a big hotel right next to the mission. So I think you could say God is in the details. with the design review. Every building has to be approved by the Architecture Review Board. So that's why San Juan Capistrano is so special, and it's a wonderful place to walk around in. Speaking of walking around, we're going to take a cruise now to historic San Juan Capistrano. Here we can see the foundation of the old stone church, which was one of the largest structures of all the 21 missions. You can see the large arches, and obviously there was no metal reinforcement in those days. You can see the bells of the mission, several of which are original, and to the left where you see the cross, you can see the rounded gable, which is the symbol of the missions. That's called Mission Revival Architecture, and that became very 1980 to 1920, Mission Revival. So let's take a stroll now. We're going to go in the mission at a later tour, but first of all, let's take a look. Notice all the buildings are brick and wood and stone. That's all that's allowed in this historic downtown. And if Carmen could take a look at the hills on the right, you will notice that there are no houses on the top because the general plan of San Juan Capistrano does not allow building on the ridge lines. Now, if we'll walk down here, I want you to look at this on the right-hand side. You can see it's got the stressed natural wood, the white stucco, and the red tile roof. Before, it was a very tacky building with parabolic arches, which are totally non-historic. They're not the Roman Italian arches that the Spanish adopted. So the city tore down the building and is redoing it. Are we still going? Okay. So you can see that they've got special on San Juan, which is typical of a city that has design review. You can always tell the quality of a city by the sidewalks. Now we're walking towards the famous where you can get a beer at any time of the day. One of my favorite places. Very, very friendly. Now if you look down the street, Carmen, on the right-hand side, down toward El Adobe, you can see 3 adobes that are lined up. Those date back to 1780 and 1790. One of them has been converted to a famous restaurant, El Adobe. Richard Nixon, former President Nixon, would dine there.
Our journey now has taken us to Verdugo Street, another historic part of San Juan Capistrano. And look how gorgeous it is. I'm standing in the middle of the street, but usually it's pretty busy. And they've done a great job bringing this back to its historic state, and just a place so you can enjoy it when you come for different activities and dining. So Bill, tell us about the importance of Verdugo Street, because the next part of our walk is going to be straight down, and there's a lot of great things right at the end of Verdugo Street.
Thank you, Dorothy. Well, the interesting thing about Verdugo Street is that the mission allowed the Native American Ahashiman people to build adobes on Los Rios Street. And Verdugo Street, Verdugo, by the way, means executioner. Verdugo Street was the connection from the mission to the Los Rios neighborhood, which we're going to visit next. So the city of San Juan was so smart, they realized how beautiful this street was and how important it is, so look what they did. They put planters, they repaved it, they even put festival lighting for the evening. Because, let's face it, thousands of tourists are going to walk from the mission down to historic Los Rios district. So they did an absolutely beautiful job refurbishing this street. This is a new building. Wow, it's just gorgeous. Look at the stressed wood. Notice how they, without having an ugly, tacky sign. And look at the down lighting. The down lighting will highlight the sign. They chose a sycamore tree. That's a native California tree. They put some drought-tolerant landscaping in. This is one heck of a town, let me tell you. They also have a nice wine bar and restaurant called Rancho Capistrano. And look at the hay bales. That's typical because San Juan Capistrano is a very equestrian town. My sister-in-law is president of the Equestrian Society, and you don't want to mess with horse people. So there's a Regency Theater. They did a nice job at putting it in brick, part of the design review again. There's an increasing number of great restaurants. And then something great that San Juan Capistrano did is they put in a, I think they serve an important purpose. They allow people to park without destroying the streetscape. So people can park here and walk around to the Mission, Los Rios Historic District, or the many restaurants. So any great downtown has a parking structure. Now, as we look around to the right, you can see the famous Capistrano Depot. When the southern Capistrano, it totally changed the town. That's a beautiful Mission Revival structure, and it is now a restaurant. By the way, I proposed to my wife at the depot. Woohoo! Okay, now as we walk towards Los Rios, you can see the city has put in these vintage lampposts, large. I think those are cool. And then I want to point out something. I'm a little corny, Dorothy will say this, but look at the bollards. Any good city that has a pedestrian area has bollards. Bollards keep cars out and they can be attractive. Now something that's brand new is this San Juan Capistrano clock sign. It was put in by the Rotary International, and it's very historic, and this is where people get on the train. So I think it's totally appropriate. Here's the information kiosk, nicely historic. And this is where people get on the train. And they can go south all the way to San Diego. It's about an hour drive. Or you can get on the train and you can go north and you can go to Los Angeles. And it's also just about an hour. Okay, now we're entering Los Rios Historic District. This is actually the oldest continuously lived in neighborhood in California, because as I said, the mission allowed the Native Americans and the soldiers to build adobes along the river and along Los Rios Street. They didn't have to stay within the confines of the mission. So historically, what's significant about this is it was declared a National Register Historic District. That means it is so famous historically that it's been recognized by the national government. And if you have a structure here, you can get a tax break if you refurbish it. So this is beautiful. This wooden structure here is an example of what came in after the adobes. This is a 1880s board and batten type Western, because San Juan Capistrano was kind of a rough Western town from about 1850 to 1890. Okay, this is Los Rios Street in Los Rios Historic District, and look at how beautiful it is. This is the oldest neighborhood in California. The trees are over 100 years old. The buildings were built in 1880 and 1890. And let's face it, Orange County is a new county, so people are thrilled to come here in the history and the shade. It's absolutely gorgeous. And in the spring, when the butterfly sanctuary plants are blooming, people go crazy. I mean, we need history and we need places like this. And by the way, the Ramos House Cafe is a fantastic place. It's right here. It's a fantastic place to have brunch. It's a very, very creative menu.
I wanted to share with you the Los Rios area because it's so wonderful. I can't begin to tell you how many visits I've come to San Juan and I never crossed the tracks. Figured it was the other side of the tracks, but boy is this special. And the historic components that are here, and it's historic, they will look like this forever. So make sure when you come, wear your walking shoes, because there's a lot of great things to see. But the historic components go on and on between restaurants and shopping, and even a lawyer's office is great. Oh, and here's a horse.
Yeah.
Look at this. We just told you about the equestrian. Look at her. And this is
what kind of horse is it? It's called a Pony of America. That looks bigger than a pony. How old is your horse?
She's 11.
Wow, that's very cool. And do you ride her every day when you can?
Yeah, I do. I ride 6 days a week.
Wow, how come you're riding bareback?
I have a better feel bareback. I like bareback.
That is cool. Is San Juan a great equestrian town?
It is.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different
That's cool. Well, you're great. Thank you for showing off. Okay,
Have a good day.
bye-bye. Okay, so let's walk over now. There used to be 40 adobes on Los Rios Street outside of the Mission. This is the Montañas adobe. The woman who lived here in 1880 was Polonia Gutierrez, and she married someone named Montañas. But she was quite an important figure in the Los Rios neighborhood. She was a midwife, so she helped to birth a lot of children. And one great story about her is there was a drought, so she also loved teaching. So she got her students together, and they did field trips to pray for rain. They went north, no rain. They went south, no rain. So they decided to have another field trip, and it started raining cats and dogs. So this is the beautiful Montañas adobe. And you can see this is the butterfly garden. You can probably see that butterfly right there. I'm not sure what kind it is. It certainly isn't a monarch. But this place blooms all year long, especially in the spring. It's absolutely gorgeous. And this is cared for by a volunteer group called the Gardening Angels. They take care of this for free, and they also take care of the beautiful landscaping of the San Juan Capistrano Mission. Wow, look at this beautiful globe mallow. It's a subtly beautiful plant. So you can see we've still got some bloomage even though it's summer. And that's a good picture of by the way, adobe was the preferred construction material since there wasn't enough wood. And adobe is a good insulating material because it's thick and it stays cool in the summer. Okay, this is something I really love about this Los Rios Historic District. They put a history wall in. So they talk about the first people who lived here were the Native Americans called the Ahashiman, and they lived close to water. When they became Christianized, they became known as the Juaneño Indians. But this history wall, let's take a look. This Rios adobe is one of the oldest continuously lived in homes. The original Rios was one of the soldiers of the Spanish Army. So you can see some of these historical pictures. I want to show you one that's a really sad story. So if you take a look at this woman, Modesta Avila, she didn't like the train coming through because it was noisy. So one day she put her laundry out to block the train. She took it away before the train came, but she still got in trouble, and she was sent to San Quentin prison, and she died at age 22. Now that is depressing. Isn't that sad? All she wanted to do was get a little less noise in town. So there's the depot. You can see before a lot of landscaping. Here's one of the original residents, Damian Rios, whose family still lives in that adobe. And there's Delfina Olivares, who has a beautiful coffee shop right down the way, and Chief Clarence Lobo of the Juaneño Band of Indians. And I want Carmen, the city of San Juan, they really have a good touch. Look at this beautiful Los Rios Park. They use beautiful stone, drought-tolerant landscaping. They have a parking structure, not a parking structure, a parking lot which is dirt, which is appropriate. This is historic. You don't need to pave everything. And look at these kids. They're enjoying their muffins here, beautiful sitting space, their shade. This place is, I think this is the coolest place in Orange County. I mean, it's historical, it's comfortable, and it's beautiful. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is the Rios adobe, and Stephen Rios is in the same family that first settled here in the late 1700s from a Spanish soldier family. Really?
Yeah, whoa.
Because there's a bristlecone pines, up by...
Up high in Colorado, we have a lot of them, and they're
So this is the Los Rios Historic District sign. Notice it says National Register of Historic Places. That is the second highest designation that a district can have. The only higher designation is a National Landmark District. For example, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina are national landmark historic districts, but this is the second highest designation. So Carmen's going to show you the connection from Los Rios District to Verdugo Street. Isn't that a beautiful connection? And look at how they dolled it up, and I think it's totally appropriate. Okay, so we're going to conclude our walking tour at the O'Neill Museum, which is the headquarters of the San Juan Capistrano Historic Society. And if you take a look at the structure, it's typical Victorian. Victorian architecture means architecture before 1900. You can see the lace barge board right underneath the 1331 address sign. You can see the decorative small fencing. This decorative woodwork was typical of Victorian architecture. I would call this home folk Victorian. Also, the man who lived here was Juan Garcia. He was a saloon owner, and this structure was actually closer to Camino Capistrano, but he sadly was murdered, and they never found out what the motive was. One thought was they wanted to get his property. But anyway, another family called the Pryors bought the residence, and they moved it here to historic Los Rios Street. Now, the last thing I want to say is it's called the O'Neill Museum because the O'Neill family donated $60,000 to refurbish this museum, which I think is wonderful. Remember, the O'Neill family Richard O'Neill rancho from the Forster family, and that became Mission Viejo, Rancho Santa Margarita, and Rancho Mission Viejo. So the O'Neill family is a ranching family, and they also develop beautiful planned communities. So I hope you enjoyed our walk through history, and I want to bring it back to Dorothy. Remember to take a second look. There's lots of beauty around.
Thank you, Bill. This has been fabulous, and I hope you enjoyed our walk through San Juan Capistrano. I know we're not on the bus. I know we're not all together, but we would love to have you come to San Juan and enjoy the things that we have this morning. Remember, it's a short ride. It's 20 minutes. And look at that car. Somebody left their car here. It's been a while, but needless to say, you can drive to San Juan, enjoy your day. Come hungry, because there's a lot of great restaurants, and we'll talk about that on another visit with us. But we appreciate your time. We look forward to seeing you again. So in the meantime, consider this a hug. We love you. Bye-bye.
Welcome, everybody, to my talk on California history. My name is Bill Hoffman, and I'm the loyal tour guide for the Chicago Club. People know me as Hoffy, and my tour company is called Hoffy Tours. Since we can't get on a bus quite yet, I'm going to lead you on a series of fun virtual tours through the Southland. I've been a teacher all my life. I taught high school and college. Really love teaching, so I hope you enjoy these talks that I'm doing. They're supposed to be educational, and I think they'll be fun. Today's talk developed from a lot of the wonderful places that we visited on our tours. California history is really all around us, on our street names, our city names, and historic monuments. I wonder, did you study California history in 4th grade? I know I did. Quite frankly, I don't really remember anything except I made an adobe brick, which I dropped on my way to school. So I started researching California history, and I found out that it has a really amazing story to tell. In only 100 years, it went from an area of Native American societies to a Spanish colony, to a Mexican territory, to the 31st state of the United States. It's a story of Spanish explorers, Franciscan missionaries, Mexican ranchos, and even a gold rush. So come and join me as we explore these amazing 100 years of California history. And by the way, I love the Chicago Club. Okay, my talk is going to focus on the period of time from Spanish colonization to statehood. So we'll go to the second slide. What I found to be quite amazing, in less than 100 years, California saw tremendous change. First of all, we had the Native American period from 13,000 BC to the 1700s. Then we had European exploration, then Spanish colonization with the missions, and then the Mexican Rancho period, and then California statehood. So if you look at the time when the missions were established to when California became a state, it's less than 100 years. So it's hard to believe how much happened. So before we look at that 100 years of history, let's take a look at the Native American period. The Native Americans came to California and North America from Asia. They crossed the Bering Strait 15,000 years ago. And unlike what happened in central Mexico, where one large group dominated the area, which was the Aztecs, California had scores of diverse cultures. You can see from this map some of the many different Native American cultures that were dominant in California. They spoke over 100 mutually unintelligible languages. Some of the language families were Shoshonean, Algonquin, and Uto-Aztecan. And it turns out that California had one of the highest population densities of Native Americans of any part of the US. These different Native American groups had different specialties. In the Northwest, they needed more canoes because there were more rivers. In the Northeast, there were salmon and acorns to harvest. And the picture on the bottom left is the Chumash group, and they built these tunnels to go across to the Channel Islands. Their estimates were there were about 300,000 Native Americans living in California at the time of the arrival of the Spanish. It turns out that they were hunters and gatherers, and if they couldn't get enough animal protein, they often harvested seeds, nuts, and tubers. As a matter of fact, acorns were a very important part of their diet. But acorns have a lot of tannins in them. So you have to soak them in water to get the tannins out, and then you crush them. But it turns out that it's quite a lot of protein when you do it that way. Some of these Spanish explorers described the Native Americans as diggers because they would often dig into the ground for tubers and roots. As far as animals they hunted, well, let's take a look at the next slide. They hunted salmon, trout, elk, deer, rabbits, and also many types of birds. But agriculture was not possible in most parts of California because the climate was too dry. Also, these Native Americans were protected from the epidemics that struck the East Coast Native American groups that were brought over by the Europeans because of the Sierra Nevada mountains and the desert. As far as what the Native Americans look like, well, remember, there were many different tribal groups, but because the climate was so warm, they tended to wear little clothing. They wore animal pelts, sometimes plant-based clothing, but it was a warm climate, so they didn't overdress, that's for sure. So this picture right here is near San Juan Creek, and you can see that the climate was wetter, and this particular group is building what they call quichas, which are homes that are conical, made from small trunks, and then they would put reeds over the top for protection. An important part of the Native Americans' life was basketry. Since they were hunters and gatherers, they needed baskets to gather medicine, to gather roots and berries and things that they had. And the basketry of the Native American groups in California is quite famous. It's one of their cultural specialties. They were for gifts, they were for medicine, they were for carrying babies. Not too many ceramic baskets, though. Those were made more by the Southwest groups in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, the Pueblo, Navajo, and Hopi groups. But look at these beautiful baskets. They are very, very famous. Some of them were woven and some of them were coiled. But one of the saddest things about the Native American period is when the Europeans arrived, of course, there were lots of epidemics. The Spaniards inadvertently brought smallpox, measles, influenza, syphilis, and dysentery. And this caused a huge population decline. And then when the missions were established, there was even more exposure to these epidemics. But you can see from a population of about 300,000 in the late 1700s, the population would go down almost 80,000 in only 40 years, and then would go down more than 100,000 by the time of the gold rush. And sadly, after the gold rush, there was a second genocide when some of the miners and prospectors of the gold rush actually carried out massacres and murders of Native Americans between 1840 and 1870. So this is a very sad legacy of the European contact. However, the good news is that the 20th century rebound, California now has over 700,000 Native American groups, the largest in the US. Now, when we look at Spain and California, it's a really interesting story because Spain actually was not very interested in California. They were more interested in the gold and silver that was found in New Spain, which is Mexico, or Peru, where there was lots of gold. It turns out, if you look at the map, California is too far away. So when Spain came to the New World, they were looking for spices, but they discovered a whole continent. And then they quickly discovered gold and silver, which made the colonial cities of Mexico and Peru and Ecuador very, very rich. They were able to buy the spices from the Philippines. They shipped them back to Spain. They shipped back the gold and silver. And they were able to buy goods from England and the Netherlands to finance the lifestyle of the Spaniards. I think the Spaniards should have built a few more factories rather than castles, but that's another story. But since there was no gold, California was kind of off the map for the Spanish explorers. The first Spanish explorer was the famous Juan Cabrillo. He was actually a conquistador who helped Hernan Cortez conquer the Aztecs in the city of Tenochtitlan in central Mexico. He later he lived in Guatemala. He did have slaves, and he went up the coast with his galleon and he explored California for the Spanish king. He first entered California in San Diego Harbor in 1542. So that's the first European contact in California. He went all the way up the coast past San Francisco, but interestingly enough, he never discovered San Francisco Harbor, which is, of course, our greatest bay or harbor. He did hypothesize that the Native Americans were a subsistence culture, that there wouldn't be a lot of gold or riches, and Spain was really then not so interested in California. It also turned out that he was attacked by Tongva warriors on San Miguel Island. And when he came off the boat, he broke his leg and he developed a gangrene. And he is buried actually on Catalina Island. But the Spaniards wouldn't come back for almost 80 years, and then they wouldn't come back for another 100 years. Here's a picture of Juan Cabrillo's famous galleon, the San Salvador. These galleons were called the stallions of the sea. They had a great capacity for cargo. They had to store, of course, a lot of gold and silver and supplies, and also horses, and they held up to 90 sailors. So you can go down to the Maritime Museum and actually go aboard the recreation of Juan Cabrillo's San Salvador. A really fascinating thing about California was early map makers thought that California was an island. It got its name from a novel in the early 1500s about this island led by a Black warrior queen named Calafia. And this island was ruled by these strong women, but unfortunately they would feed the intruders to the winged creatures called griffins. And a lot of the early map makers thought that Baja California was actually an island, not a peninsula. And many of the early explorers talked about a place called the Strait of Anian. it was a passage to Asia and to the rich area of spices. So there's a picture of what they thought early California was, and that was actually the Bering Strait. But early map makers thought it was the passage to Arctic North America or to Asia. So California gets its name from Queen Calafia, a mythical island called California. So I think that's kind of a fun way to start our history of California. Another famous explorer now was Sebastián Vizcaíno, who in 1602 left from Acapulco and he came up the coast of California. He even went past San Francisco, and he actually renamed areas that Cabrillo had named. He named Catalina Island, Carmel, the Santa Barbara Channel Islands, and Monterey. But once again, he did not do a lot of inland exploration, and since there was no gold, Spain was not interested in settling this area and would not return for over 150 years. Now comes Gaspar de Portola, one of the most famous explorers of California history. So what happened is Spain began to get serious about settling California. So they decided that they would need to explore it. So a ship left from the Pacific coast of Mexico. They left with 219 sailors, and they arrived in San Francisco. Unfortunately, many of the sailors were sick with scurvy. They still didn't understand that vitamin C cured scurvy. So over 75 of the sailors were too sick to start this famous expedition by Portola. So 61 soldiers left with Portola to explore all the way up and to try to find Monterey Bay, which was described by Cabrillo and Vizcaíno. These soldiers were called leather jackets because that's what they wore. So they take off, and this, imagine way back in this period, only Native Americans lived in California. So they were seeing California before invasive species. They were seeing wild grasses, roses, grizzly bears, pronghorn antelope. And all along the way, they had to find water sources. They found in general lots of Native American villages. The Native Americans were very, very friendly. They were interested in the trinkets that Portola brought with his people. The only group that was a bit hostile were the Miwok group from the San Francisco Bay Area. Portola's group was attacked by grizzly bears several times. In fact, there were areas where the Native Americans would not settle and build villages because of grizzly bear attacks. It's kind of interesting that along with Portola was Juan Crespi, and he wrote a journal about all the things that they saw. So I highly recommend a book called Alta California by Nick Neely. He's a young man who gets a backpack and he goes from San Diego to San Francisco to recreate the famous expedition of Portola. And Portola came all the way through Orange County. And a lot of the names we have are from Portola. Portola Parkway, Portola Valley, Portola College. So let's take a look. So thanks to Portola's explorations, he set the stage for the 21 missions going all the way from San Diego to Sonoma. And that is, of course, called El Camino Real. These beautiful string of missions, about a day's walk in between. And you can see in the picture the staff with the bell. When you see the staff and the bell, you know you're on the royal road of the missions. And the photograph on the bottom right are the mustard seeds. The urban legend is that Portola and his soldiers would drop mustard seed along the ground so that the Franciscan missionaries could follow easily from one mission to the next. As you know, those mustards are now an invasive species in California. We'll never get rid of them, but they are quite beautiful. So the California strategy was to develop Upper California or Alta California. They needed to build missions, pueblos, which are towns, and presidios, which are forts. They knew that they had to compete with the English. Sir Francis Drake arrived north of San Francisco in 1579. In fact, there's a National Historic Landmark, Drake's Bay, where he claimed part of California for England. And the Russians were interested in California for the seal pelts and for the otter pelts. So California had to get serious about colonizing and developing California. On the bottom right, you can see the soldados de cuero, the soldiers with the leather jackets. So Spain built 4 military districts called presidios. And the presidios were typically in a quadrangle, in a square, so they could be defended. There's one built in San Diego, Santa Barbara, Monterey, and San Francisco. And they weren't actually attacked that often, although there was a French pirate who also lived in Argentina named Bouchard. He did attack and burn Monterey in 1818, and he did a smaller attack at San Juan Capistrano. Now, obviously, these presidios would be built close to the shore because they had to keep their eye on possible pirate raids. The most beautiful presidio and the most restored is the one in Santa Barbara. I really recommend going there, and there's an interesting story behind it. Bouchard the pirate was off the coast contemplating an attack, so the soldiers of the presidio convinced the townspeople to walk back and forth along the ramparts so that the presidio would appear to have more people than it actually had. So I recommend the Presidio in downtown Santa Barbara. Now, as the Spanish built missions and pueblos and presidios, they needed a building material and there weren't enough trees, so they used adobe. Adobe is simply clay with straw, which is allowed to dry. And they could build walls that were 2 to 3 feet thick, which could be very solid, which could keep buildings cool in the summer and warm in the winter. They provided good insulation, although they could rarely be several stories. So another problem, though, with adobe is when it rains, the adobe, being mud, would simply wash away. So the Spanish, with the help of the Native Americans, would grind up shells and limestone, and they would cover the adobe with this white coating, and that would prevent the adobes from washing away and keep them quite strong. They also had to have lighter pitched roofs so that the building wouldn't collapse. So there was usually a wood a wood ceiling, and then there was red tile above it. On the picture on the right is Old Town San Diego. By the way, there were missions in Baja California, quite a few of them, as a matter of fact. They were built even slightly earlier than the Franciscan missions. They were founded mostly by the Jesuits, but the Jesuits were deemed to be too powerful by Carlos III, the King of Spain, and he expelled the Jesuits from the Baja missions, but many of them are still there in Baja California. So how did the mission system work? It was kind of an ingenious setup. The idea was that if Spain could baptize the Native Americans and they could become citizens of New Spain, of Alta California, they could become part of Spain and its colonies, and that would make Spain more powerful. They usually had 2 Franciscan priests per mission, about 6 soldiers, and an average of 1,000 natives. You can see this diagram. You can see in the front is the barracks of the soldiers. You can see the mission grounds, which is a quadrangle where lots of the work happened. And in the back, you can see the rancheria. The rancheria is where the Native Americans lived, and then they would work during the day. You can also see on the bottom left, you can see what looks like a ditch. It was always very important to bring water to the missions. And those waterways were called zanjas. Z's are pronounced in Spanish like an S. Those are zanjas. So these missions some of them were actually quite elaborate. They raised cattle, horses, and sheep. They had specialty crops, including corn and grapes for wine. They had skilled vocations where they tanned hides and they made soap and candles. And the Spanish tried to be careful to allow the Native Americans to practice some of their traditional dances and festivals. But then again, they were being converted to Catholicism, which was a whole totally different new way of life. They estimate that about 15% of the Native Americans rebelled against converting to Catholicism. They often fled the missions. They were captured and punished. There were definitely some revolts. There was a revolt against San Diego's mission, and there was a large revolt by the Chumash in the Santa Barbara missions. But the whole idea was to convert the Native Americans to a totally different religion. Their religion previous was animism, a worship of nature. The Native Americans' forced labor was important for the missions, and these newly baptized Native Americans were called neophytes because neo means new, brand new, and they were recently baptized to the Catholic Church, and they obviously did the hard labor. They could not go back to their old way of life in many cases because the Spanish cattle had destroyed the native grasslands. And yes, there were lashings that were meted out as punishments. But these missions are our most famous link with our early history in California. So let's take a look at some of the missions. One of the biggest missions is Mission San Luis Rey. It's actually a National Historic Landmark, which is the most prestigious nomination that a building or site can get in the United States. It's called the King of the Missions. It has 200,000 acres. It had 3,000 Native American workers and 65,000 livestock. It is located between San Juan Capistrano and San Diego and has an absolutely beautiful church. The Carmel mission is one of the most beautiful. That was the second mission, and that would become the headquarters of the mission system. This is where Father Junipero Serra, who became a saint, lived for the most part. Because of his tireless work in evangelism and the fact that he converted so many Native Americans to Catholicism, he was officially canonized by Pope Francis in 2015. However, his canonization was very controversial because sadly, so many of the Native Americans died due to the endemic diseases. So when he was named a saint, many of the Native American groups protested, and you've probably heard that several of the statues of Father Junipero Serra have been torn down. Yes, he did punish some of the Native Americans, but he also protected some of them for more brutal punishment. So Saint Junipero Serra is buried at the beautiful Carmel mission. Another beautiful mission is very close to us, Mission San Juan Capistrano. It's called the Jewel of the Missions. One of the famous things about it was in 1812, the old stone church sadly was toppled by an earthquake, and 40 parishioners sadly died that morning. And since there was no reinforcement, they never rebuilt the old stone church, and it is now a memorial to those who have perished. Also, the return of cliff swallows that migrate every year from Argentina became a famous tourist draw, along with a song about the return of the swallows in Capistrano, made San Juan Capistrano one of the most famous missions. And it is also one of the most popular and heavily visited missions. Absolutely beautiful. Look at those California poppies. San Antonio de Padua is a beautiful mission. It's actually located on property that was donated by William Randolph Hearst. And over the Santa Lucia Mountains, which were named by Vizcaíno, by the way, is where Hearst Castle is. And Julia Morgan, the famous California architect, designed a beautiful hotel very close to Mission San Antonio de Padua. Another great mission is Mission Santa Barbara. Mission Santa Barbara is continuously operated by the Franciscans. They were never expelled from that mission. It was destroyed by earthquakes twice and rebuilt. And one of the more interesting stories is this woman that you see on the left-hand side. She was a Nicoleña woman. Her Nicoleña tribe lived on San Nicolas Island, the most remote of the Channel Islands. And what happened was this Nicoleña group had been attacked by trappers. So a later group decided to evacuate the Nicoleñas. But for reasons historians don't quite understand, Juana Maria never got on that boat. So she was stranded for 18 years on San Nicolas Island. And eventually, some missionaries and explorers came back. They found vestiges of her settlement, and they got her to come back to Santa Barbara. She spoke her Nicoleña dialect, but sadly, the Chumash Indian language, it was mutually unintelligible, so they couldn't communicate. She seemed to be happy to be in Santa Barbara, but sadly, she died 7 weeks after she arrived on the mainland, and she is buried at Santa Barbara Mission. So inspiring is her story that an award-winning children's novel, The Island of the Blue Dolphins, was written, and it was inspired by the life of Juana Maria, who lived on San Nicolas Island for over 18 years. Quite a story. I've seen her grave marker there at Santa Barbara. But the Spanish did not only build missions, they also built towns. And Los Angeles, the largest city in California, is one of those towns. And it was very interesting. It was founded in 1781. The actual name is La Reina de los Ángeles de Porciúncula, the Lady, Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels of Porciúncula, which was the name of a nearby river. And the Spanish did not mess around when it came to building cities. The laws of the Indies required every city to have a plaza. And you can see the diagram of the Plaza del Pueblo, which was mandated by the King of Spain. And that's why going to Mexico and South America is so interesting, because every town has a plaza, including Los Angeles. And they also required arcaded buildings and a church to be located right near the plaza. But sadly or not sadly, depending on your viewpoint, the missions declined rather quickly. That's because Mexico broke away from Spain in their War of Independence. Many Mexican citizens who weren't born in Spain were tired of the discrimination, and they didn't think Mexico was benefiting the way the people born in Spain were. So Mexico successfully broke away from Spain, and the missions were secularized. The land was supposed to be distributed to many of the Native Americans, but it was mostly given to settlers. Mexico appoints governors to the distant territory of Alta California, and more foreigners move into California. And the picture on the bottom right, you can see that the Mexican Rancho period is about to begin. And the word for cowboy in Spanish is vaqueros. So the missions were officially secularized in 1834. And as I said before, many of the Native Americans were supposed to get land, and they weren't given any land. The Spanish Franciscan priests were required to sign an oath of allegiance to Mexico, or they were expelled from the missions. Here they are, and they're expelling the Spanish Franciscan priest from Mission San Juan Capistrano. And it turns out, by the way, that an Englishman, John Forster, married the sister of the Mexican government, Pio Pico, and he inherited over 200,000 acres of land, and he decides to go live in the mission after he bought it. And it wasn't until Abraham Lincoln in the 1850s decides to give the missions back to the Catholic Church. Now, this is a very interesting time period in California. The people that were Mexican citizens who were born in California were called Californios. They were often the sons and daughters of the soldiers, and they lived in California for this rancho period. There were about 800,000 of them total. They made their money from hides, from their ranches, and they traded for finished goods, mostly from New England. Their economy, as I said before, was based mostly on ranches, and they started to begin trading with the ships that came from Boston. These Boston trading ships were actually called department stores on ships, because they had finished goods like furniture and metal and spices and perfume that the Californios needed and wanted. And the diagram on the left is one of these New England traders who's throwing the cowhide off the cliff onto the boats. Now, one of the most famous of these Yankee traders is Richard Henry Dana. He wrote a book called 2 Years Before the Mast in the 1840s. It's one of the few books about California written from the perspective of a US settler of what early California was like. So he came around Cape Horn, and by the way, you can look at the map on the left. That's a 3-year trip around the treacherous Cape Horn. And his ship, the Pilgrim, went up and down the coast of California, trading finished goods for hides, which would go back across to Boston to be made into boots and leathers and hats. He describes getting off the ship in Santa Barbara and seeing one of the famous fandangos, one of the parties that the rancheros, the Californios would give. And I thought one of the things great about him was he wanted to fight for sailors' rights. So when he got back to New England, he became a lawyer and he fought for sailors' rights, because you can imagine in the 1840s and 50s, sailors did not have lots of rights. So I think Dana Point named themselves after a hero, Richard Henry Dana. You might have heard that the Pilgrim, the replica of the Pilgrim, actually sank in the harbor recently, and they're currently restoring it. These hides were so important to the California economy, they were called California banknotes. Not only would they use the hides for furniture and leather, they would also use the fat that they rendered for soap, tallow, and candles. Now, this rancho area is very interesting, because the Mexican governors were given the authority to give large land grants to soldiers' families and to people that they felt were worthy. And they gave over 450 land grants. And many of the names of the areas that we know of, like Santiago, San Joaquin, Trabuco, Mission Viejo, come from these rancho area land grants. Now, this era of California history really interested me, the golden age of ranchos. These California ranchers were aristocratic. It was almost a feudal style agricultural economy. They didn't really need money, because they would sell the hides for the finished goods that they wanted. So it was an economy based on barter, honor, and trust more than money. Here's a picture of the famous fandango, which was the 2 or 3 day party they would use to celebrate a saint's day or a birthday. And one of these was witnessed by Richard Henry Dana. This was the era of dons and doñas. By the way, the mascot of University of San Francisco is the Dons. So it's also interesting to note the architecture and the extent of these ranchos. It is huge acreage. The average rancho land grant was 18,000 acres, and that totaled almost 9 million acres of land in California. So as you go up and down the coast, you can see that California has preserved many of these rancho headquarters or ranch homes. And the boundaries of the ranchos are also quite interesting. You can see the names. The Spanish land grants before Mexico broke away from Spain: San Pedro, Los Feliz, Simi, Las Virgenes, Santa Ana were Spanish land grants. Mexican land grants included Temescal, La Brea, Los Alamitos, Cerritos, Tahunga, Duarte, and the list goes on. And one that's close to Laguna Woods is Rancho Santa Margarita y Las Flores. Bolsa Chica is not far up the road. But the Rancho period does not last very long. Remember, I said in less than 100 years, we go from a Native American period to a mission period to a ranch period. And the Rancho period did not last very long because war would break out between Mexico and the US. And then the gold rush would bring in so many settlers. 500 vessels would come into San Francisco Harbor in 1849, that the Rancho period would come to a slow decline. Now, the American military would obviously have a very uneasy alliance with the Mexican governors because prior to 1848, remember, California still belonged to Mexico. There's a great book I recommend called The Decline of the Californios. It's about how after California became a state, these Mexican citizens called Californios were still allowed to own these large acreages, but slowly but surely they lost their land title because they didn't have the proper documentation, and they often lost in court. Sorry, I went in the wrong direction. So we had this Mexican-American revolt, and it's interesting to know how California got its flag. So it turns out that the war broke out in 1846, and a few months later, a group of about 24 settlers and trappers decided that they were going to take over Sonoma. And by the way, it took 3 months for California to know that the United States had declared war on Mexico. So these settlers come into Sonoma and they capture the Mexican government, Vallejo, the Mexican governor that you can see seated there on the left, and they make him swear allegiance to the new California Republic. They hastily design a flag with the brown bear or the grizzly bear, and they hoist the flag and they declare the California Republic. But they weren't a very organized force, and several months later, a larger American force would capture Monterey, and they would raise the flag, the American flag, in Monterey, and that was the true capturing of California. So this was a brief rebellion called the Bear Flag Revolt, but that's a very beautiful town to go to, Sonoma. They have a gorgeous plaza, and the mission is right there. The Mexican-American War was not very bloody in California, fortunately. The California campaign had very few battles. They were mostly in Southern California. Mexico at the time had a fairly weak government, and they couldn't really bring a large army to bear. There were several battles east of San Diego and San Pascual. There was a battle in San Pedro and in San Gabriel. But remember, there were only about 1,500 California residents, and many of them really were almost more like Californians than they were Mexicans. So they had sort of a loose allegiance to Mexico, and they weren't anxious to fight. But when the US military captured Monterey, the war was over. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico gave, and you can see the large chunk of land that Mexico gave to the United States, all of California, parts of Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. But interestingly enough, that treaty and the Treaty of Cahuenga said that the Californios who owned these ranches could still hold the title, and many of them would become US citizens. So as I said before, the treaty guaranteed the property rights to the Mexican Californios, but they would have to prove their title to the Lands Commission, and many of their property deeds were not regarded as sufficient, and many of them lost their land. So as you go up and down the coast of California, some of these original Californio families certainly continue to own land and are now US citizens, but many of them did lose their land. So I think you'd agree, this is a pretty amazing history. A lot happened in a short period of time. So what's the legacy of this time period? Well, first of all, the mission period is certainly important in our curriculum. It's part of the fourth grade curriculum, and over 500,000 kids visit our missions every year. But there is, of course, a change in focus. It's not now a sort of sanitized version of how happy the Native Americans were, because in many cases, as you know, that was a tough life, and many of the Native Americans died. So the new curriculum is more realistic, and it says, what was life like for the Franciscan priests? What was life like for the Native Americans? I remember that I had to build an adobe brick for my mission project, and I sadly dropped it on the way to school. But our missions are a very, very important part of our legacy. And in Mission San Juan Capistrano, there's a very interesting room on the Native Americans and how they lived off nature. Also, the Mexican land grants are very, very important. Because of these Mexican land grants, they had so much land that American settlers and American citizens could go in and buy property, and they could buy huge tracts of property, and they could build these amazing planned communities. They could, for example, Irvine was based on Rancho Santiago and Santa Ana's huge rancho. Mission Viejo was built from Rancho Santa Margarita y Las Flores. So is Ladera Ranch in Santa Margarita. And by the way, Camp Pendleton and the US government actually bought part of that ranch, which was originally part of that original Mexican rancho. Rancho Niguel, that Mexican land grant became the city of Laguna Niguel. So Southern Orange County is super famous for these planned communities, and they probably wouldn't have been possible without these large Mexican land grants. Also, there's the mission myth. There was a famous author named Helen Hunt Jackson, and she wrote a novel in 1884 called Ramona. It's about a California girl who's half Native American, and she falls in love with a Native American worker, and they leave their home, and they face all sorts of disasters and discrimination. But the book was actually meant by Helen Hunt Jackson to show attention to the discrimination against Native Americans. But what it actually did was it got people fascinated in coming to look at these missions and learning about the Spanish, Mexican, and Native American past. It actually caused a boom, including the Ramona pageant. And later she would go to Congress and continue to fight for Native American rights. And she didn't necessarily mean this to be just a tourist novel that would spawn tourism. Also, some of the legends of California. Here's Joaquin Murrieta, who was called the California Robin Hood. He was a Mexican who lived in Southern California, whose family was attacked and several members were killed. So he goes on a rampage and he fights and steals property from some American settlers. And he was later killed. And some people think that that sponsored the Disney movie Zorro, and also The Curse of Capistrano, starring Guy Williams. And also, one of the legacies of this California period is ranch life. One good example is the Leo Carrillo Ranch. Leo Carrillo was a famous Mexican-American actor. He was Pancho in the Cisco Kid, and he donated land to California. He became a parks commissioner, and he established a famous ranch in Carlsbad. And that single-story look of his ranch became very popular in the 50s and 60s in Southern California. That's the ranch-style home you can see on the bottom left. And also, this famous California history is part of our Spanish-Mexican legacy. Santa Barbara, which is probably the most famous town for reviving the Mexican-Spanish period, they have their fiesta days every August where they relive their history, and they basically close down the town for the entire week. Oh, another fun story about that. After they had their earthquake, Charles Lummis, who was a famous preservationist who walked to California all the way from Ohio and also fell in love with the Native American cultures, he convinces Santa Barbara to rebuild in Mexican and Spanish architectural styles, not Victorian, which you can find anywhere back in the East Coast. Also, the art has been highly influenced by the Native Americans, Mexican, and Spanish period. I love the artist Millard Sheets, whose famous mosaics grace home savings buildings all throughout Southern California. They're now called Chase banks, but you can see a lot of these pictures are from the Native American or Spanish period, and you can still see those mosaics today. Needless to say, the great food of northern Mexico influenced Southern California, and it's something that we love today. These are Sonoran-style tacos. Also, the mission-style architecture of the rounded gables became known as Mission Revival. Look at the picture on the bottom. That's actually the California Pavilion. That is the pavilion that we built for the Chicago World's Fair. And as you can see, the rounded gable looks like a mission because that's what everybody thinks of when they think of early California. Look at the facade on the left. It looks exactly like the Santa Barbara Mission. And look at the photograph on the upper right. That is the train station in Fullerton. Look at the rounded Mission gable. And of course, Taco Bell would use the Mission gable. Why not? That's early California architecture. The old Herald Examiner building, gorgeous building, built by Julia Morgan in downtown Los Angeles, Mission style. And then, of course, a lot of our famous old towns and parks are graced with Mexican and Spanish colonial architecture. Here is the beautiful Balboa Park on the left, very gorgeous Mexican churrigueresque architecture that was meant to commemorate the opening of the Panama Canal. And the Santa Barbara County Courthouse, which is a National Historic Landmark, is a beautiful example of early Spanish 1920s architecture. And it's also a National Historic Landmark. And also demographics. There's about 13 million Mexican American residents in California, and about 500,000 of them claim to be descendants of the Spanish and Mexican periods. We also have almost 1 million Native Americans who live in California, the most in the United States. You can see the diagram on the bottom left. That's the number of Mexican Americans who live in the United States. The diagram in the middle is the Native American groups in California. The picture on the right is the Agua Caliente Casino near Palm Springs. So here's my conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed this, but in less than 100 years, it's kind of amazing what happened in this state of ours. First of all, the Native Americans went from a hunting and gathering lifestyle to being converted to Catholicism, and for them, it was a tragic period of change. Many of the Catholic Franciscan missionaries, sadly, would fill out more death certificates than birth certificates due to these epidemics. And then we had the period of Spanish colonization. It was about a 50-year period of the building of the missions. And certainly it caused major changes. It set the stage for the westernization of California. It set the stage for the Rancho period and the new economy of California. Then we have the Californio or Rancho period. I call it the brief pastoral period of California. That was a period where ranchos and cowboys were showing the lifestyle of California, and they were increasingly trading with the East Coast traders who would come up and down the coast. And then finally, we had that period of rapid immigration in the late 40s, and Manifest Destiny would win out. Gold would be discovered, and California would become the 31st state in the Union. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on California history. The more I study California history, I realize there's so much to know. And until we can get back on a bus again, I'm going to do these presentations once a month. I love doing them. I'm going to do a presentation on the history of Orange County and why Orange County broke away from LA County. By the way, my daughter was just married at the old Santa Ana courthouse. I have a fun presentation on nature in California. How can nature survive in a state of 40 million people? I have a very fun presentation on architectural styles and it's all about building watching. It's really fun. California has more different architectural styles than anywhere in the world. And then I have a fun lecture on the 20 most interesting places in Southern California. So until we can get on the bus with a wonderful Chicago club, we're going to have some fun lectures, and we're going to explore our beautiful state with these lectures. Be well, everybody, and I really enjoyed this, and I look forward to talking to you again. Be well. Bye-bye. This is Bill Hoffman.